So from the stash of analysis books that I have, it's not that big, but it's getting bigger, one book out every couple of weeks, every month or so. I wanted to show how the chapter of what's called sequences and series of functions in Rudin is covered in these four books. But really, the main theme really is that I've slowly converged on four books. So I'm reading Wade as my main book. I'm always going back to Rudin because there are some good examples and some more advanced concepts that, of course, Rudin writes them in a poem form, but they're good to go look up. And then Bartle and Sherbert is really good at the basic level. I mean, this book is really meant for analysis courses where people are not going to be math majors. I rarely go to this book, to what I call TBB, Thomson, Bruckner. Thomson, Bruckner. Yeah, TBB. Anyways, because even though it's got a lot of content, it's at a fairly simple level for a lot of the things that I've studied. And I have found when I look into it and when I read carefully that it's like, oh yeah, Wade already did this. Okay, that's fine, that's good. But incredibly enough, when it comes to anything having to do with sequences, anything having to do with infinite series, and anything having to do with sequences and series of functions, just as titled in Rudin, and power series, this book is really good. And so now that I have stumbled, I will say, in working on chapter 7 problems, I'm just going to take a little detour and go through very carefully and read all of the sections for those chapters in these books. So I'm going to go back and just read them and I'll start by featuring TBB. This book just goes into it in great detail, and I love the way they did it. It really is very well done. So I'm gonna take my time next week and tomorrow and read a lot about series, and of course read the chapter on power series back here. Well, read the one, of course, the main theme, sequences and series of functions, but then go in detail and read about power series. Even though I'm familiar with them, I just want to do it right. I want to be able to go back and do all the problems with ease, which does not seem to be going to be the case unless I do that reading. So in the case of, let's do Wade, even though I wanted to do TBB first because it's got so much. So in the case of Wade, he does them back to back. He goes into, in chapter 6, and he does infinite series of real numbers, and then in chapter 7 he does, did I say chapter 7 or 6? Yeah, chapter 6 is infinite series of real numbers, and then chapter 7 is infinite series of functions. And of course Wade did a great job. It's got a lot of material, very deep. Again, like I said when I talked about my update, he's got a really nice, interesting section with using the binomial theorem, which I don't think anybody else does, at least amongst the books that I have. But then in the case of Rudin, which I've seen in other books, breaks it up. He has actually for Rudin I usually have to make this, zoom in a little because it's a smaller book. He's got the numerical sequences and series chapter, very straightforward, mostly vanilla content that you find in other books, with some twists and turns that are typical of Rudin, and he puts in some tests that are put in the later chapters in other books. But then when he gets into sequences and series of functions, Rudin goes a little bit over into the deep end and discusses, let me get to it, discusses the Stone-Weierstrass theorem, which is a theorem for approximating functions. I did actually collect some handouts on this theorem, very interesting, and I'm going to read them. I haven't set it aside, but in typical Rudin fashion, this content fits a lot better after you've read about Fourier series. Now, I do know about Fourier series, but I want to wait until I read that chapter. And in Wade, that's near the end. So my read for this particular topic in Rudin is going to have limited use for myself for what I'm trying to do right now. I think most of the bang for the buck I'm going to get out of TBB, so that's where I'm going to be concentrating on. And then Bartle and Sherbert does the same thing that Rudin does, which is he's got a sequences and series chapter, which is interesting and well done, as always with these authors. And then he's got very briefly, or they have very briefly, a series of functions section. And I'm going to go through it. But really, it's TBB that I'm going to be using heavy duty. That's the one that will get... I'm trying to pick it up and I'm sounding, I'm sure, like I'm very far away. Yeah, so this will be the book that I'll be focusing on for this topic.